David walked through the school hallway with his head down, clutching his backpack straps tightly. At 16, he was bigger than most kids his age, not because he was tall, but because he carried extra weight that made him stand out in all the wrong ways. Every morning felt like walking through a minefield, never knowing when trouble would find him. The trouble usually came in the form of 4 seniors who seemed to have nothing better to do than make his life difficult. Ryan was their leader, a tall guy with perfectly styled hair who acted like he owned the school. Behind him followed his 3 friends, Alex, who always had that mean smirk on his face, Ben, who laughed too loud at everything Ryan said, and Chris, who just seemed angry at the world. David had learned their schedule by heart. They hung out by the main staircase before first period, spent lunch near the gym, and always walked through the math hallway after school. He planned his routes carefully, taking longer paths to avoid them. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. Today wasn't going to be one of the good days. David could tell because Ryan was already looking his way during morning announcements, that familiar cruel smile spreading across his face. The kind of smile that meant trouble was coming. When the bell rang, David tried to slip out quickly, but Ryan's voice cut through the noise of students shuffling to their next class. "Hey, big guy, where you going so fast?" David's heart sank. He could have kept walking, pretended he didn't hear, but experience had taught him that ignoring them only made things worse. He stopped and turned around slowly. "I'm just going to class," David said quietly, hoping his voice didn't shake. "Just going to class," Alex repeated in a mocking tone, making his voice higher and whiny. The others laughed like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. "You know what, David?" Ryan said, stepping closer. "I think you need to learn some manners. When someone talks to you, you should show respect." David felt his face getting hot. Other students were walking by, some slowing down to watch what was happening, but none of them stopping to help. That was always the worst part, feeling completely alone while surrounded by people. "I wasn't being disrespectful," David managed to say. "See, there you go again," Ryan said, shaking his head like he was disappointed. Talking back, "That's definitely not respectful." Before David could respond, Ben reached over and knocked his backpack right off his shoulder. Books and papers scattered across the hallway floor, and students had to step around them as they walked by. "Oops," Ben said with fake innocence. "Looks like you dropped something." David knelt down to gather his things, his face burning with embarrassment. As he reached for his math notebook, Chris deliberately stepped on it, leaving a dirty footprint right across the cover. "Better clean that up," Chris said. "Wouldn't want to hand in messy work to your teacher." The 4 of them walked away laughing, leaving David alone on the floor surrounded by his scattered belongings. A few students helped him pick up his papers without saying anything, their faces showing sympathy but also relief that it wasn't happening to them. This was David's reality every day at Lincoln High School. What none of them knew, what nobody at school knew, was that 3 times a week David went to a small gym on the other side of town. There, in a converted warehouse that smelled like sweat and rubber mats, he had been training in martial arts since he was 8 years old. His instructor, Mr. Park, was a quiet man in his 50s who had trained fighters all over the world. When David's mom first brought him to the gym, she was worried about her son's confidence and thought martial arts might help. She had no idea how seriously David would take to the training. For 8 years, David had been learning discipline, technique, and control. He could throw punches that could break boards, execute kicks that could drop a grown man, and use grappling techniques that could control opponents twice his size. But Mr. Park had taught him something even more important than fighting skills. A true martial artist never fights unless there is no other choice, Mr. Park would say during every class. "We train not to hurt others, but to protect ourselves and people who cannot protect themselves. The strongest person is the one who walks away from a fight." So David walked away. Every single day he walked away. Even when Ryan and his friends pushed him, called him names, or humiliated him in front of other students, David remembered Mr. Park's words and chose not to fight back, but it was getting harder every day. During lunch, David usually sat alone in the library where it was quiet and safe. Today he couldn't concentrate on his sandwich because his hands were still shaking from the morning incident. He kept thinking about how easy it would have been to grab Chris's wrist when he stepped on the notebook, twist it just slightly, and watch the bully's confidence disappear. The thought scared him because part of him really wanted to do it. After school, David took his usual longer route to avoid the main exit where Ryan's group liked to hang out, but as he walked past the parking lot, he heard familiar voices behind him. "There's our friend again," Ryan called out. David's stomach dropped. He kept walking, hoping they would get bored and leave him alone. "Hey, don't ignore us," Alex shouted. "We're talking to you." David stopped walking but didn't turn around. He could hear their footsteps getting closer. "You know what I think?" Ryan said, now close enough that David could smell his cologne. "I think you've been avoiding us." "That hurts my feelings." "Yeah," Ben added. "We just want to be friends." David finally turned around to face them, knowing that trying to keep walking would only make them follow him home. "I haven't been avoiding anyone," he said. "I just mind my own business." "Mind your own business," Chris repeated. "Guys, did you hear that? He minds his own business." They were standing in a circle around him now, just close enough to make him feel trapped, but not close enough for any teachers to think something was wrong if they happened to look over. "Here's the thing, David," Ryan said, his voice getting that dangerous edge it got when he was about to do something cruel. "This is our school, which means everyone here is our business, including you." David felt his hand starting to clench into fists without him meaning to. 8 years of training had made it automatic. When faced with a threat, his body prepared to defend itself. But his mind fought against the instinct, remembering Mr. Park's lessons about control and discipline. "I don't want any trouble," David said, forcing his hands to relax. "Too bad," Alex said with that mean smile, "because trouble just found you." As David stood there surrounded by the 4 older students, he made the same choice he made every day. He chose to walk away, even though every muscle in his body was telling him he could end this right now if he wanted to. But walking away was getting harder each time. And deep down, David wondered how much longer he could keep making that choice before something inside him finally snapped. 2 weeks after the parking lot incident, things got worse. Much worse. David thought he had been careful about avoiding Ryan and his crew, but they seemed to be everywhere now. In the morning by his locker, during lunch in the library, after school near the bus stop. It was like they had made tormenting him their full-time job. The worst part was gym class. Coach Williams was a nice enough guy, but he was also coaching the basketball team and often got pulled away during class, leaving students to change in the locker room without supervision. That's when Ryan's group would strike. It started small. They would hide David's clothes while he was in the shower, making him search frantically while other students watched and snickered. Then they began taking his gym bag and dumping everything out, mixing his clean clothes with the dirty towels on the floor. "Looking for something?" Alex would ask innocently while David scrambled to gather his things. "This is getting old," David muttered one day, finally finding his shirt under a pile of wet towels. "What did you say?" Ryan asked, stepping closer. David's heart started beating faster. He hadn't meant for them to hear him. "Nothing," he said quickly. "I didn't say anything." No, I think you did," Ben said, crossing his arms. "Sounded like you had something to say about us." The locker room went quiet. Other students who had been changing suddenly became very interested in their shoes, not wanting to get involved or become the next target. "I just want to get dressed and go to class," David said, trying to keep his voice calm. "See? There's that attitude again," Ryan said, shaking his head. "Like you're too good for us or something." Before David could respond, Chris grabbed his gym bag and turned it upside down, dumping everything onto the wet, dirty floor. His clean clothes, his deodorant, his house keys, everything scattered across the grimy tiles. "Whoops," Chris said with fake surprise. "Butterfingers." David stared at his belongings on the floor, feeling something dark and angry building up inside his chest. His fists clenched automatically, and for a moment, he pictured himself grabbing Chris by the shirt and showing him exactly what Butterfingers really felt like. But then he heard Mr. Park's voice in his head. "The strongest person is the one who walks away from a fight." So David knelt down and started picking up his things again, ignoring the laughter around him. That evening at the martial arts gym, Mr. Park noticed something different about David's training. His kicks were harder, his punches more aggressive. During sparring practice, he was fighting with an intensity that wasn't usually there. "Everything okay?" Mr. Park asked during a water break. "Yeah, everything's fine," David lied, not making eye contact. Mr. Park studied him for a moment. After 30 years of training fighters, he could read people pretty well. "You know, David, I've been thinking about entering you in a tournament next month." You've been training hard and I think you're ready to test your skills. David looked up, surprised. Really? You think I'm good enough? I think you're more than good enough. But tournaments aren't about beating people up. They're about discipline, control, and respect. Think you can handle that? David nodded enthusiastically. The idea of actually using his skills in a real competition, even a controlled one, excited him in a way that scared him a little. Good, Mr. Park said. But remember, what you learn here stays here unless you're protecting yourself or someone else who can't protect themselves. These techniques aren't toys, and they're not for getting revenge on people who make you angry. David wondered if Mr. Park somehow knew what was happening at school, but he just nodded and went back to training. The next day brought a new level of humiliation. During lunch, David was sitting in his usual spot in the library when Ryan's group found him. The librarian was helping some younger students in the computer section and couldn't see what was happening. Well, Ryan said, sliding into the chair across from David. Having lunch all by yourself again? David tried to ignore them and kept eating his sandwich. You know what I heard? Alex said, sitting down next to David. I heard that fat kids like you have to eat special food or they'll explode. The others laughed like this was comedy gold. Is that true, David? Ben asked, leaning over to look at his lunch. Is that an exploding sandwich? Before David could react, Ben grabbed his sandwich and took a huge bite out of it. Tastes pretty normal to me, Ben said with his mouth full, crumbs falling onto David's notebook. David felt his face getting hot. That sandwich was his lunch. His mom had made it for him that morning, cutting it just the way he liked it and adding extra cheese because she knew it was his favorite. Give it back, David said quietly. Give what back? Ben asked innocently, taking another bite. My lunch. Give it back. But I'm helping you, Chris said, reaching over and grabbing David's bag of chips. Didn't you hear, Alex? We're preventing you from exploding. They passed David's lunch around the table, each taking bites while he sat there helplessly. Other students in the library noticed what was happening, but nobody said anything. Nobody ever said anything. When they were done, there was nothing left but crumbs on the table. Thanks for sharing, Ryan said, wiping his hands on David's notebook. You're such a generous friend. They walked away laughing, leaving David staring at the empty spot where his lunch used to be. His stomach growled, but that wasn't what hurt. What hurt was the complete helplessness, the way they could take anything they wanted from him and he couldn't do anything about it. That night, David trained harder than ever. He hit the heavy bag until his hands were sore, practiced his kicks until his legs ached, and worked on grappling techniques until sweat was pouring down his face. You're pushing yourself pretty hard tonight, Mr. Park observed. I want to get better, David said. Not stopping his practice. Better at what? Fighting? Or controlling your emotions? David stopped punching the bag and looked at his instructor. Sometimes I think about what it would be like, David admitted, if I didn't have to hold back. If I could just... He trailed off, not wanting to finish the sentence. Mr. Park nodded slowly. I understand. Everyone gets angry sometimes. Everyone wants to fight back when they're being treated unfairly. But that's exactly when our training matters most. Not when it's easy to be disciplined, but when it's hard. But what if someone keeps pushing? What if they never stop? Then you have choices to make. You can talk to adults who can help. You can remove yourself from the situation. But if someone is in real danger, yourself or someone else, then you do what you have to do. The key is knowing the difference between wanting revenge and needing protection. David thought about this as he walked home that night. Was what was happening to him something he needed protection from? Or was it just embarrassing and annoying? He got his answer the next week. It was Thursday and David had managed to avoid trouble all day. He was feeling pretty good as he walked to his locker after last period, thinking he might actually make it home without incident. That's when he saw them surrounding a small 7th grader near the water fountains. The kid was maybe 12 years old with thick glasses and a backpack that looked too big for his skinny frame. David recognized him. His name was Tommy, and he was in the school's advanced math program despite being 2 years younger than most students. Ryan was holding Tommy's backpack while the kid reached for it helplessly. Please, Tommy was saying, his voice shaking. I need my books for homework. Homework? Alex laughed. What kind of loser actually cares about homework? The kind who thinks he's smarter than everyone else, Ben added. David stopped walking. This was different from what they did to him. Tommy wasn't just overweight or an easy target. He was a little kid who couldn't possibly defend himself. "I don't think I'm smarter than anyone," Tommy said quietly. "I just want to go home." "Well, you can't," Chris said, grabbing Tommy's glasses right off his face. "Not until you learn some respect." Tommy immediately became helpless without his glasses, squinting and reaching blindly for them while Chris held them up high. "Please," Tommy begged, tears starting to form in his eyes. "I can't see without those." David felt something change inside his chest. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about a little kid who was scared and helpless, and David was the only person around who could do anything about it. For the first time in 8 years of training, David started walking toward a fight instead of away from one. David's hands were shaking as he walked toward the group surrounding Tommy. Every instinct Mr. Park had trained into him was telling him to be careful, to think before acting, to find another way. But watching a 12-year-old kid cry because he couldn't see without his glasses had pushed David past the point where careful thinking mattered. "Hey," David called out, his voice stronger than he expected. The 4 seniors turned around, surprised to see their usual victim approaching them instead of running away. "Well, look who it is," Ryan said with that familiar cruel smile. "Come to join the party, big guy?" "Give him his glasses back," David said, ignoring the way his heart was pounding. Alex burst out laughing. "Did you just give us an order? Did the fat kid just tell us what to do?" "I said give him his glasses back," David repeated, stepping closer. Tommy was still squinting and reaching blindly for his glasses, bumping into the water fountain as he tried to orient himself. David could see how scared and confused the kid was, and it made his anger burn even hotter. "Or what?" Chris asked, still holding the glasses high above Tommy's reach. "What are you going to do about it?" David looked at Tommy, who was now feeling along the wall, trying to figure out where he was. The kid was completely helpless and terrified, and these 4 guys thought it was funny. "Last chance," David said quietly. "Last chance?" Ben repeated mockingly. "Guys, I think David's trying to sound tough." What happened next took about 3 seconds, but it felt like slow motion to David. Chris, still laughing, deliberately dropped Tommy's glasses on the concrete floor. The sound of the lenses cracking was sharp and final. Tommy immediately dropped to his hands and knees, frantically feeling around for the broken pieces while tears ran down his face. "Oops," Chris said with fake innocence. "Butterfingers again." That's when something snapped inside David's chest. Before Chris could react, David's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. 8 years of training kicked in automatically. David twisted Chris's arm in a way that made him drop to his knees instantly, crying out in pain and surprise. "What the hell?" Ryan shouted, stepping forward. David released Chris and turned to face Ryan, his body moving into a fighting stance without him even thinking about it. For the first time since he'd known them, David saw something in Ryan's eyes he'd never seen before. Uncertainty. "Give me the backpack," David said calmly. "Are you crazy?" Alex asked, but David noticed he wasn't stepping forward like he usually did. "There are 4 of us and 1 of you." "I know," David said, and there was something in his voice that made all 4 of them hesitate. Chris was still on the ground, holding his wrist, staring up at David like he was seeing him for the first time. "How did you do that?" Chris asked, his voice shaky. David didn't answer. He was watching all 4 of them, the way Mr. Park had taught him to watch multiple opponents. "Stay calm, keep track of everyone. Be ready for anything." "Ben, grab him," Ryan ordered, but his voice didn't have its usual confidence. Ben looked at Chris, who was still on the ground, then back at David. "You grab him." Nobody moved. Tommy was still on his hands and knees, picking up pieces of his broken glasses. David could hear him sniffling, trying not to cry too loudly. "The backpack," David said again, extending his hand toward Ryan. "You're making a big mistake," Ryan said, but he tossed the backpack toward David anyway. David caught it and knelt down next to Tommy, keeping his eyes on the 4 bullies. "Tommy, it's okay," David said gently. "I've got your backpack. Let me help you up." Tommy's hand found David's arm, and David helped him stand up. The kid's face was streaked with tears, and he was holding the broken pieces of his glasses. "They're ruined," Tommy whispered. "My mom's going to be so upset. These were expensive." David felt his anger flare up again. He looked at the 4 seniors who were watching nervously. "You're going to replace his glasses," David said. "Like hell we are," Alex said, but he was standing farther away than before. "Yes, you are," David said, and he took a step toward them. The four of them actually backed up. David couldn't believe it. These guys who had been tormenting him for months, who had made his life miserable every single day, were backing away from him. It was like seeing them clearly for the first time. They weren't as big or as tough as he'd thought. They were just bullies who picked on people they thought couldn't fight back. "You know what your problem is?" David said, his voice getting stronger. "You only pick fights you think you can win. You go after kids like Tommy because he's small and can't defend himself. You go after me because you think I'm weak." "You are weak," Ryan said, but there was no conviction in it anymore. "No," David said, shaking his head. "I just chose not to fight. But that was my choice, not yours. And I'm done making that choice." Chris finally managed to get back on his feet, still rubbing his wrist. "You can't just attack people," Chris said. "I could report you to the principal." David almost laughed. "You want to go tell Principal Martinez that you were picking on a 7th grader, broke his glasses, and then I stopped you? Go ahead." "Let's go right now." The four of them looked at each other uncertainly. "That's what I thought," David said. He turned back to Tommy, who was still holding the broken pieces of his glasses. "Come on," David said gently. "Let's go to the office and call your parents. And don't worry about the glasses, they're going to replace them." "We didn't agree to that," Ben protested. David turned back to look at them, and something in his expression made Ben take another step back. "You broke a kid's glasses and made him cry," David said quietly. "The only question is whether you're going to do the right thing and replace them, or whether I'm going to have to make you." "Are you threatening us?" Ryan asked. "I'm giving you a choice," David said. "Same choice I had every day when you guys decided to make my life miserable. Except now you know that I can defend myself, and more importantly, I can defend other people who can't defend themselves." The hallway was completely quiet except for the sound of Tommy sniffling. Other students had noticed what was happening and were watching from a distance, but nobody was moving closer. "This isn't over," Ryan said, trying to regain some authority in his voice. "Yes, it is," David said firmly. "It's over for me and it's over for Tommy, and it's over for anyone else you think about picking on. Because now you know that someone is watching and someone will stop you." Chris looked at his wrist again, then at David. "How did you learn to do that?" "I've been training since I was 8, David said. 8 years of martial arts 3 times a week, learning discipline and control and how to defend people who need defending." "You've been training for 8 years?" Alex asked, his voice smaller than usual. 8 years, David confirmed. "And the only reason I never used it before is because my instructor taught me that fighting should be the last resort. But when you pick on little kids who can't fight back, when you break their glasses and make them cry, that becomes the last resort." David helped Tommy gather the rest of his things and started walking toward the principal's office. Tommy's glasses cost $200. David called over his shoulder. "You have until Monday to figure out how you're going to pay for new ones. And if I see any of you bothering him again, or bothering anyone else who can't defend themselves, you'll find out what else I learned in those 8 years of training." As they walked away, David heard one of them mutter, "How were we supposed to know he was some kind of ninja?" Tommy looked up at David with his squinting eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Nobody's ever stood up for me before." "Everyone deserves to feel safe at school," David said. "And from now on you will." For the first time in months, David felt something he'd almost forgotten: pride in himself. Not for winning a fight, but for finally using his strength to protect someone who needed protection. But he also knew that this was just the beginning. Word would spread quickly through school about what had happened, and David had no idea what would come next. All he knew was that he was done being afraid, and he was done letting bullies hurt people who couldn't fight back. Walking down that hallway with Tommy beside him, David felt like he was walking toward a completely different future than the one he'd been living. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't scared of what that future might bring. By Friday morning, everyone at Lincoln High School had heard some version of what happened between David and Ryan's crew. The story had grown and changed as it passed from student to student, the way stories always do in high school. Some people said David had knocked out all 4 seniors at once. Others claimed he was a secret black belt who had been hiding his abilities for years. A few even whispered that he was related to some famous martial arts movie star. David tried to ignore the stares and whispered conversations as he walked to his locker, but it was impossible. For the first time since starting high school, people were actually looking at him with something other than pity or disgust. Some looked curious, others impressed, and a few seemed almost scared. The weirdest part was how different the hallways felt. For months, David had moved through school like he was invisible, trying not to draw attention to himself. Now it seemed like everyone was watching him, waiting to see what he would do next. "Is it true?" a voice asked behind him. David turned to see Katie, a girl from his chemistry class. She was one of those students who usually kept to herself, not popular but not an outcast either. "Is what true?" David asked, though he had a feeling he knew what she was talking about. "That you know martial arts, that you stopped Ryan and his friends from picking on that 7th grader?" David shrugged. "I just helped a kid who needed help. But you really know how to fight?" Before David could answer, another voice joined the conversation. "He definitely knows how to fight," said Mike, a junior who David recognized but had never actually talked to. "My little brother was there. He saw the whole thing. Said you dropped Chris like he was nothing." "I didn't drop anyone," David said, getting uncomfortable with all the attention. "I just made him let go of the kid." "That's not what I heard," Katie said, her eyes bright with curiosity. "I heard you took on all 4 of them at once." "That's not what happened," David said firmly. He was starting to understand how rumors worked, and he didn't want this story getting even more blown out of proportion than it already was. But Mike was already shaking his head. "Dude, don't be modest. Those guys have been terrorizing people for years and you finally stood up to them. Everyone's talking about it." As if to prove his point, David noticed a group of younger students watching him from across the hallway. When they saw him looking, they quickly turned away and started whispering excitedly to each other. This was not what David had wanted. He hadn't stood up to those bullies to become some kind of school celebrity. He'd done it because a little kid needed help and no one else was going to provide it. "Look, it's not a big deal," David said, closing his locker. "I just did what anyone would have done." "No, you didn't," Katie said seriously. "Most people would have walked away. I would have walked away. But you didn't, and that matters." During first period English, David noticed that even his teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, was looking at him differently. She didn't say anything directly, but when she was talking about the characters in the novel they were reading, she kept glancing in his direction when she mentioned courage and standing up for what's right. At lunch, David went to his usual spot in the library, hoping for some peace and quiet. Instead, he found 3 different students already sitting at nearby tables, all pretending to read but obviously hoping to sit near him. Tommy appeared next to his table, wearing a brand new pair of glasses. "They paid for them," Tommy said quietly, adjusting his new frames. "Ryan came to my house last night with the money. He wasn't happy about it, but he paid." David looked up surprised. "Really, all of it?" "Every penny. $200, just like you said." Tommy sat down across from David, looking much more confident than he had the day before. "My mom wanted to know what happened. I told her you stood up for me when nobody else would." "You didn't have to tell her that." "Yes, I did. She wants to call your parents and thank them for raising someone who would help other people." David felt his cheeks getting warm. He wasn't used to people saying nice things about him, and he definitely wasn't used to parents wanting to thank his family for anything. "There's something else," Tommy said, lowering his voice. "Other kids have been asking me about you. Kids who get picked on by different people. They want to know if you would help them too." David felt a weight settling on his shoulders. "Tommy, I can't be the school's bodyguard. What happened yesterday was about you being in trouble and me being the only person around who could help." "I know," Tommy said quickly. "But just knowing that someone like you exists, someone who won't just walk by when bad things happen, it makes people feel safer." Before David could respond, someone else approached their table. It was Jake from his gym class, a quiet kid who always seemed nervous about changing in the locker room. "Hey, David," Jake said hesitantly. "Can I ask you something?" David nodded, though he was beginning to feel overwhelmed by all the attention. "Those seniors who were bothering you and Tommy, they've been giving me trouble too. Nothing as bad as what they did to you guys, just small stuff. Taking my lunch money, hiding my clothes, that kind of thing." Jake paused, looking embarrassed. "I was wondering if maybe you could just, be around sometimes when they usually bother me. Not to fight or anything, just so they know someone's watching." David stared at Jake, realizing that his decision to help Tommy had consequences he hadn't thought about. Other students who were being bullied now saw him as some kind of protector, and he had no idea how to handle that responsibility. "I don't want to start fights," David said carefully. What I did yesterday was about stopping something that was already happening. I understand, Jake said. I'm not asking you to hurt anyone. I just thought that maybe if they saw you around, they might leave me alone. David found himself nodding before he really thought about it. Okay, when do they usually bother you? Jake's face lit up with relief. Usually after gym class when Coach Williams isn't around. Maybe if you could just hang around the locker room a little longer after class? I can do that, David said, and Jake practically bounced away from the table with happiness. Tommy was smiling at him. See, you don't have to fight anyone. Just being there makes a difference. That afternoon, David did exactly what Jake had asked. After gym class, instead of changing quickly and leaving like he usually did, he took his time getting ready. Sure enough, Ryan and his friends showed up, clearly planning to hassle Jake about something. But when they saw David calmly putting on his shoes, they hesitated. What are you still doing here? Alex asked, trying to sound tough but not quite managing it. Getting dressed, David said simply. Same as everyone else. Ryan looked at Jake, then back at David, clearly trying to decide if it was worth the risk. After a moment that felt much longer than it actually was, Ryan jerked his head toward the exit. Come on, guys. Let's get out of here. They left without bothering Jake at all. Jake came over to David's locker, grinning widely. That actually worked. They just left. Don't get too comfortable, David warned. This was just one time. They might try again when I'm not around. Maybe. But at least now they know that someone's paying attention. That makes a huge difference. As David walked home that day, he thought about what Tommy and Jake had said. He hadn't wanted to become the school's unofficial protector, but maybe that's exactly what had happened. The question was, what was he going to do about it? At martial arts practice that evening, Mr. Park noticed that David seemed distracted during training. Everything okay? Mr. Park asked during their cool-down stretches. David told him about the events of the past 2 days, about helping Tommy and Jake, and about how other students were now looking to him for protection. Mr. Park listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally as David explained how complicated things had become. Sounds like you're learning one of the hardest lessons about martial arts, Mr. Park said when David finished. What's that? That once people know you can protect them, they start depending on you to do it. And once you start protecting people, it becomes very hard to stop. David frowned. Is that a bad thing? Not bad, but complicated. You have to decide how much responsibility you're willing to take on, and you have to be smart about how you handle it. You can't fight every bully in school, and you can't be everywhere at once. So what should I do? Mr. Park smiled. What do you think you should do? David thought about it for a moment. Help when I can, but be smart about it. Don't go looking for fights, but don't walk away when someone really needs help. Sounds like wisdom to me, Mr. Park said. Just remember, the goal isn't to become the toughest guy in school. The goal is to make school a place where people don't need to be afraid. Walking home that night, David realized that his life had completely changed in just 2 days. He was no longer the invisible, picked-on kid who tried to avoid attention. He was someone people looked to for help, someone they trusted to do the right thing. It was scary and exciting at the same time, and David had no idea where it would lead. But for the first time since starting high school, he was looking forward to finding out. 3 weeks later, Lincoln High School felt like a completely different place, at least for David. The morning hallways that used to fill him with dread were now just normal corridors where he walked to class like any other student. Ryan and his crew still went to the same school, but they seemed to have found other things to occupy their time that didn't involve tormenting other students. The change wasn't dramatic or obvious. There were no big confrontations or movie-style showdowns. Instead, it was like the entire social balance of the school had shifted slightly, and everyone was still figuring out what that meant. David discovered that word had spread beyond just the students. During a particularly boring history class, Mr. Peterson asked to speak with him after the bell rang. David, I wanted to thank you for what you did for young Tommy last month, Mr. Peterson said, organizing papers on his desk. His mother called the school to tell us how grateful she was that someone looked out for her son. David felt his cheeks getting warm. I just did what anyone should have done. Actually, that's not true, Mr. Peterson said, looking up at him seriously. Most people would have kept walking. Most adults would have kept walking. But you didn't, and that says something important about who you are. I don't want people to think I'm some kind of tough guy or anything, David said quickly. I'm not looking for fights, Mr. Peterson smiled. That's exactly why what you did mattered so much. You didn't help that boy because you wanted to prove how strong you were. You helped him because it was the right thing to do. There's a big difference. That afternoon, David was walking past the main office when Principal Martinez called his name. David, could I see you for a moment? David's heart jumped. Even though he hadn't done anything wrong, being called to the principal's office still made him nervous. Principal Martinez's office was smaller than David had expected, with diplomas on the walls and family photos on her desk. She gestured for him to sit down in the chair across from her. I've been hearing interesting things about you lately, she said, but her tone was friendly rather than accusatory. I hope they're good things, David said carefully. They are. Very good things. I understand you've been helping other students who were having trouble with bullying. David nodded but didn't say anything, unsure where this conversation was heading. I also understand that you have martial arts training.
Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am. Since I was 8, Principal Martinez leaned back in her chair. You know, we've been having problems with bullying at this school for years. We try to address it when we know about it, but most students don't report these incidents. They're afraid of making things worse or being seen as snitches. I can understand that, David said. What's interesting is that since your situation with those seniors, we've had several students come forward to report bullying incidents they never told us about before, and we've noticed a significant decrease in the number of new incidents being reported. David wasn't sure what to say to that. I'm not naive, Principal Martinez continued. I know that having someone like you around, someone who can defend himself and others, probably makes potential bullies think twice about their actions. But I also know that we can't rely on students to police each other. That's our job as educators. She leaned forward. So I wanted to ask you something. Would you be interested in helping us start a peer mediation program? Nothing involving physical confrontation, just training students to recognize bullying situations and know how to respond appropriately. David was surprised. You want me to help teach other kids? I think you'd be perfect for it. You understand what it feels like to be bullied. You've shown good judgment in how you handled a difficult situation, and other students clearly respect you. What do you think? David found himself nodding. Yeah, I'd like that. I'd like to help. Excellent. I'll have our guidance counselor, Mrs. Kim, contact you next week to discuss the details. As David left the office, he realized that helping Tommy that day had started something much bigger than he'd ever imagined. He wasn't just the kid who stood up to some bullies anymore. He was becoming someone who could actually make a difference in how the school worked. At lunch that day, his usual quiet table in the library had become a regular meeting spot for several students. Tommy was there, of course, along with Jake and Katie. A girl named Lisa from his math class had started sitting with them too. And today there was a new face, a freshman named Carlos who looked nervous but determined. David, Carlos said quietly, I wanted to thank you. For what? I don't think we've even talked before. You haven't helped me directly, Carlos explained. But those seniors who used to bother you and Tommy, they were starting to pick on me too. But after what happened with you guys, they just stopped. It's like they decided it wasn't worth the risk anymore. David looked around the table at all these students who had somehow become his friends without him really noticing it happening. You know what's funny? Katie said. I used to eat lunch by myself in the bathroom because I was afraid of running into certain people in the cafeteria. Now I actually look forward to lunch. Same here, Jake added. It's weird how much better school feels when you're not constantly worried about avoiding certain people. Tommy adjusted his new glasses and smiled. My mom says I seem happier when I come home from school now. She was getting worried about me before, but she doesn't have to anymore. David felt a warm feeling in his chest that he wasn't used to. For most of his life, he'd thought of himself as someone who was acted upon rather than someone who acted. Things happened to him. Other people made decisions that affected his life, and he just tried to survive it all without making waves. But now he was starting to understand that he had more power than he'd realized. Not just physical power from his martial arts training, but the power to make choices that affected other people's lives in positive ways. That evening at the gym, David found himself training with a different kind of intensity than before. It wasn't the angry, frustrated energy he'd had during the worst of the bullying. Instead, it was focused and purposeful. You seem different lately, Mr. Park observed during a break between exercises. more centered. I think I understand now why you taught me that martial arts isn't about fighting, David said. It's about having the confidence to do the right thing even when it's scary. Mr. Park nodded approvingly. And what's the right thing? Using whatever strength you have to protect people who need protecting, whether that's physical strength or just being willing to speak up when something's wrong. Sounds like you're ready for that tournament I mentioned. David grinned. I think I am. 2 months later, David stood in front of a room full of students and teachers explaining the basics of the new peer mediation program. He wasn't nervous the way he used to be when speaking in front of people. He'd learned that when you're talking about something you really care about, the words come easier. The most important thing to remember, David was saying, is that you don't have to be the strongest person in the room to make a difference. You just have to be willing to care about what happens to other people. In the audience, he could see Tommy and Jake and Katie and several other students who had become his friends. He could also see some teachers, including Principal Martinez and Mr. Peterson. Sometimes the hardest part isn't standing up to bullies, David continued. Sometimes the hardest part is believing that you have the right to stand up for yourself and other people. But everyone has that right, and everyone has something they can contribute to making school a safer place for everybody. After the presentation, as students were filing out and talking excitedly about signing up for the program, Tommy came up to David. You know what's amazing? Tommy said. 6 months ago, you were just trying to get through each day without anyone bothering you. Now you're teaching other people how to help each other. David thought about that. I guess I learned that hiding from problems doesn't make them go away. It just makes them someone else's problem. And you learned that you're a lot stronger than you thought you were. No, David said, shaking his head. I learned that I was always strong. I just needed a good reason to use that strength. As he walked home that day, David reflected on how much his life had changed. He still went to the same school, lived in the same house, and trained at the same martial arts gym. But everything felt different because he felt different about himself. The scared, lonely kid who used to walk these same streets trying to avoid confrontation was gone. In his place was someone who understood that true strength came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the willingness to help them. David had learned that the most important fight he would ever win was the one against his own fear of standing up for what was right. And once he'd won that fight, everything else became possible. He was still David, still the same person he'd always been. But now he was David who knew that one person really could make a difference. One choice at a time, one day at a time. And that knowledge changed everything.